What if I told you that the United States defeated the German army with balloons? You are about to hear one of the most incredible classified stories of World War II. A story about artists who fought with paintbrushes, sound engineers who fought with speakers, and soldiers who risked their lives to protect a secret that didn't exist. But before we open these top secret files, help us outsmart the algorithm. Smash that like button to support the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a mission. And comment down below, if you were sent to war without a gun, what skill would you bring to the fight? Now, let's go to 1944.
June 1944, the English Channel. The water is choppy, the sky is a bruising shade of slate gray. To the south lies the fortress Europe, Hitler's Atlantic Wall. 1,000 miles of concrete, barbed wire, and machine guns waiting to chew up the invading Allies. The world is holding its breath. The invasion, D-Day, is imminent. But inside the war rooms in London and Washington, the generals are sweating. They are looking at maps, and the math isn't adding up. War is, at its core, a game of numbers. You count your tanks, you count their tanks, you count your men, you count their men. If your number is bigger and your logistics hold, you win. But in 1944, the United States Army has a problem. A secret problem that they dare not whisper outside of the Pentagon. They are running out of men. The supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. The Pacific Theater is swallowing resources. The campaign in Italy is a slow, bloody slog. General Eisenhower needs 50 divisions to break into Germany. He has maybe 30 available right now. The Germans are battered, yes, but they are professionals. The Wehrmacht is still the most efficient killing machine on the planet. They are digging in. They are watching the roads. They are counting. If they find a gap in the American lines, a 10-mile stretch of forest defended by only a handful of tired riflemen, they will punch through it. They will flank the Allies. They will drive them back into the sea. The Allies need a force multiplier. They need something that can fill the gaps. They need a reserve force that can pop up anywhere, anytime, and scare the hell out of the German high command. But the cupboards are bare. There are no more tanks to send. There are no more heavy artillery battalions ready to deploy. So in a windowless room in the Pentagon, a colonel named Billy Harris and a major named Ralph Ingersoll look at each other. They don't have tanks. They don't have men. But they have an idea. It is a dangerous idea. It is, frankly, a ridiculous idea. If they can't send a real army to the front, why not send a fake one? Why not build an army out of air? Why not build an army out of sound? Why not build an army out of lies? The proposal goes up the chain of command. It lands on desks where stiff-necked generals scoff. You want to fight panzers with balloons? You want to stop the SS with a loudspeaker? It sounds like suicide, but the math remains the same. They are desperate. The order is signed. Activate the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They are given the highest security clearance in the military, top secret. They are given a priority mission, and they are given a deadline. They are not looking for soldiers who can shoot the wings off a fly at 500 yards. They are looking for liars. They are looking for magicians. They are looking for the only people crazy enough to bring a paintbrush to a gunfight.
New York City, late 1943. The recruitment process for the 23rd was unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever seen. Usually, Army recruiters looked for sturdy farm boys, mechanics who can fix an engine in a mud pit, high school quarterbacks who understand teamwork. For this unit, the recruiters went to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. They went to the Cooper Union in Manhattan. They went to the Art Students League. They walked into studios smelling of turpentine and oil paint. They walked into fashion design classes. They walked into architecture firms. They were looking for a specific type of mind. A mind that understood perspective, a mind that understood shadow, a mind that could look at a landscape and see not just trees and dirt, but a canvas. They found Bill Blass. Before the war, he was a sketching prodigy, dreaming of women's fashion. He had an eye for fabric, for drape, for the way a silhouette moves. He was elegant, soft-spoken, and about as far from a killer as you could imagine. The army took him. They found Ellsworth Kelly, a young artist obsessed with form and color. He saw the world in shapes. He understood that camouflage wasn't just about painting things green, it was about breaking up the visual logic of an object. The army took him. They found Art Kane, a brilliant young photographer. He understood light. He knew how a camera lens saw the world, and more importantly, how it could be tricked. The army took him. They found Arthur Singer, a bird illustrator. He had the patience of a saint and an eye for the tiniest details. He knew that nature is never uniform, that patterns in the wild are chaotic. The army took him. These men received their draft notices. They boarded buses. They were shipped to Camp Forest, Tennessee. And when they arrived, they looked around at each other. It was a motley crew. There were no hardened sergeants with scars on their faces. There were sculptors rubbing clay off their hands. There were set designers from Broadway. There were sound engineers who had worked on radio dramas. They were dubbed the Cecil B. DeMille Warriors. The regular infantry units stationed nearby at Camp Forest watched them with confusion. Who are these guys? I heard they're intelligence. I heard they're washing out. They weren't washing out. They were just beginning to understand the absurdity of their job. They were issued standard issue fatigues, helmets, and rifles. They did their basic training. They learned to march. They learned to salute. But in the afternoons, while the other units were practicing bayonet drills, the men of the 23rd were doing something else. They were learning to inflate a tank.
The weapon that would define the Ghost Army was the M4 Sherman. The real M4 Sherman was a beast. It weighed 30 tons. It had a 75mm main gun. It was clad in rolled, homogeneous armor plate. It was the workhorse of the American armored divisions. The 23rd's M4 Sherman arrived in a bag. It was a pneumatic decoy. Developed by the United States Rubber Company, it was a marvel of engineering. It was made of neoprene-coated fabric, essentially the same material as a heavy-duty raincoat. It had an internal framework of inflatable tubes. The specs were ludicrous. Weight, 93 pounds. Time to inflate, 20 minutes with a compressor, 40 minutes with a foot pump. Armor thickness, 0 millimeters. Firepower, none. But when you inflated it, my God, from 500 yards away, it was perfect. The turret had the right shape. The gun barrel drooped slightly, but if you propped it up with a stick, it looked ready to fire. The tracks were painted on the side, heavy and muddy. At Camp Forest, the artists began to test their new toys. It was a comedy of errors at first. A gust of wind would catch a tank and flip it over on its back, exposing its hollow belly like a dying beetle. A soldier would lean against the steel armor to light a cigarette and sink right into the turret. Punctures were a constant threat. A stray thorn could take a tank out of action faster than an anti-tank missile. But the artists, the designers, and the engineers began to refine the process. They realized that a tank sitting in a field isn't enough to fool a German observer. A tank has weight. A tank interacts with the environment. Ellsworth Kelly and the other visual artists began to study the real tanks. Look at the tracks, Ellsworth would point out. A 30-ton tank churns the earth. It leaves a scar. A rubber tank sat on top of the grass. It looked like a toy. So they requested bulldozers. Before they set up the inflatable tanks, they would run the bulldozers through the field, carving up the mud, creating deep, violent ruts. Then they would place the rubber tank precisely at the end of the tracks. Suddenly, the toy had weight. Suddenly, the physics made sense. They studied the camouflage. The standard army camo nets were sloppy. The artists redraped them. They learned to use shadows. They learned to dress the set. They scattered empty jerry cans around the inflatables. They hung laundry lines between the tank barrels. They dug latrines. They were building a movie set, and the audience was the Luftwaffe. But the visual deception, the rubber duckies as they called them, was only one leg of the stool. A tank you can see is scary. A tank you can hear is terrifying. While the artists were wrestling with rubber in the fields, a different group of men was working in a secure lab, the 3132 Signal Service Company. These were the audio guys. Their commander, Colonel Hilton Rayleigh, had a theory. In modern war, he said, the ears are as important as the eyes, especially at night. At night, you can't see the enemy, but you can hear him. The squeal of a tank tread, the low rumble of a convoy, the shouted orders of a bridge-building crew. If you could fake the sound, you could fake the army. They went to the armored proving grounds at Fort Knox. They brought state-of-the-art wire recorders. This was before magnetic tape was common. They recorded audio on a thin spool of steel wire, moving at high speed. They told the tank crews, "Drive past us, fast, now slow, now stop and idle." They recorded everything. The metallic clank, clank, clank of tracks on asphalt, the dull thud of tracks on mud, the high-pitched whine of the turret motor, the distinct roar of a white M3 half-track, the cough of a cold diesel engine starting up. They took these sounds back to the lab and began to edit. They were the first DJs of warfare. They mixed the tracks, they layered them, they created scenarios. Scenario A, an armored column moving east at 10 miles per hour. Scenario B, a heavy tank battalion bivouacked for the night. Engines idling, men talking, metal clinking. Bridge construction, hammers, saws, splashing water, cursing sergeants. But how do you play these sounds loud enough to fool a German listening post 2 miles away? You can't use a boombox. They worked with Bell Labs to develop the heater. It was a massive 500-watt speaker. To put that in perspective, a standard home stereo is maybe 50 watts. A rock concert speaker stack is powerful, but these were designed for projection. They were mounted on the back of half-tracks. They were directional. They could aim the sound like a spotlight. The fidelity was terrifying. When they tested it at Camp Forest, they aimed the speakers at a hill 3 miles away and played the approaching tank column track. The colonel standing on that hill instinctively looked for cover. The ground wasn't shaking, but his brain told him that 50 tons of steel was about to roll over him. The bass frequencies were so low, they could be felt in the chest. The sonic unit had their weapon. The visual unit had their weapon. But there was one more element, the most subtle and dangerous of all: radio deception. The signal company, Special. The Germans were the best in the world at intercepting radio traffic. They had listening posts all along the French coast. They triangulated signals, they broke codes. If a new American division appeared on the line, the Germans would know it first by the radio waves. The traffic would spike, the Morse code would chatter, the command nets would light up. If the Ghost Army set up rubber tanks and played loud noises, but the radio waves were silent, the Germans would know it was a trap. So the Ghost Army had to create a ghost radio. They recruited high-speed Morse code operators. These men didn't just learn to tap out messages, they learned to mimic. Every radio operator has a fist, a unique rhythm and style of typing. Some are heavy-handed, some are fast, some have a lilt. The ghost operators learned to copy the fist of the real operators from the real divisions. They practiced sending fake messages that sounded boringly real, like requesting 500 gallons of diesel for Company B. Checkpoint Charlie reports all clear. Tell the captain his coffee is cold. They were scripting a radio play that would be broadcast across the entire European theater. If they messed up, if they used the wrong call sign, the wrong code, or the wrong rhythm, the game was over.
May 1944. The training was done. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed their bags. They loaded their inflatable tanks, their 500-watt speakers, their wire recorders, and their sketching pads onto transport ships. They were heading to England. The mood on the ships was a mix of excitement and dread. They knew the secret.
They knew what they were, but they also knew the reality of their armor. "If we get hit," one soldier joked, looking at a deflated tank, "we don't explode, we just hiss." It was funny, but it wasn't. They were going to war without weapons. Their only protection was the hope that the Germans would be too scared to shoot back. They arrived in England in the chaotic build-up to D-Day. The island was sinking under the weight of men and material. The 23rd was billeted in secret locations. They were kept away from the regular troops. "Loose lips sink ships," the posters said. But for the 23rd, loose lips would destroy the entire illusion. If the Germans found out that the Americans had an inflatable army, the trick would never work. They waited. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion began. The real army stormed the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The 23rd listened to the reports on the radio. They heard the casualty counts. They knew their time was coming. The breakout from Normandy was slow. The hedgerows, the bocage, were a nightmare. Ancient earthen walls, 6 feet high, lined with thick hedges. Every field was a fortress. The Germans were making the Americans pay for every yard. General Bradley needed help. He needed to trick the Germans into moving their guns. He sent the call, "Send in the special troops." Late June 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops landed in France. They drove their trucks off the LSTs and onto the shell-pocked soil of Normandy. The air smelled of dead cattle, cordite, and wet earth. They were not in an art studio anymore. They were in the kill zone. Their first mission was coming. They were nervous. The inflatables had worked in Tennessee. The speakers had worked in the quiet hills of the American South. But would they work here? Would they work against the SS? Would they work against the Panzer-Lehr Division? They were about to find out. And if the experiment failed, the 23rd would be the first unit in history to be wiped out because their tanks popped. July 1944, near Cery-la-Forêt, France. The 23rd received their first major assignment, the mission Operation Elephant. The situation was critical but typical of the Normandy campaign. The 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been fighting non-stop since D-Day. They were exhausted. Their tanks were battered. Their men were shell-shocked. They needed to pull off the line to refit and repair. But you can't just pull a tank division out of the line. If the Germans see the tanks leaving, they will attack the empty hole. The Ghost Army's job was to fill the hole. They had to slip into the 2nd Armored's foxholes at night. As the real tanks pulled out, the rubber tanks would inflate. For 24 hours, the 23rd had to convince the Germans that Hell on Wheels was still there, angry and ready to fight. Dusk, July 1st. The changeover began. It was a surreal ballet. The real Sherman tanks reversed out of their revetments, engines growling, exhaust spitting blue smoke. As soon as a real tank vacated a spot, a team of artists from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers jumped in. "Get it up! Get it up!" They unrolled the bundles of neoprene. They connected the air compressors. The hiss of air filled the twilight. Slowly, the rubber beast rose. First the tracks, then the hull, then the turret. The barrel of the 75mm gun drooped sadly. "Fix the barrel," a sergeant hissed. A private jammed a stick under the inflatable barrel to prop it up. They covered the rubber tank with the same camouflage nets the real tank had used. They checked the tracks in the mud. Within 30 minutes, the position looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, except now it was hollow. The men of the 23rd dug in. They jumped into the foxholes dug by the 2nd Armored. The dirt was still warm from the bodies of the previous occupants. There were cigarette butts, empty K-ration tins, and the lingering smell of unwashed men. Now came the waiting. This was the hardest part. In a real tank unit, if the Germans started shelling, you could button up inside 30 tons of steel. It was loud, but you were safe from shrapnel. Here, if the Germans started shelling, there was nothing to hide behind but a balloon. Midnight. A German spotter plane droned overhead, the Bed Check Charlie. The men froze.
If the pilot saw something wrong, if a gust of wind wobbled a tank, if the silhouette didn't look right, he would radio the artillery. The plane circled once, twice, then it flew on. The deception held. For 3 days, the Ghost Army held the sector. They played the sonic recordings of tank maintenance. They sent radio messages complaining about broken tracks. The Germans stayed in their bunkers, convinced they were facing a rested, dangerous armored division. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored was miles away, resting, drinking coffee, and fixing their engines. When the Ghost Army finally pulled out, they deflated the tanks, rolled them up into bags, and vanished into the night. They left behind nothing but tire tracks and silence. They had proven the concept. The lie worked.
August 1944, the port of Brest. The Allies needed a port. Normandy was clogged. They needed Brest. But the city was a fortress, held by 38,000 fanatical German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger. The American 8th Corps was laying siege to the city. They needed to pinpoint the location of the German heavy artillery batteries. Colonel Rayleigh of the Sonic Company had an idea, a dangerous idea. "We can use the speakers to draw fire," he said. "We'll drive the heater tracks up to the front line. We'll play the sound of a tank column attacking. The Germans will panic and fire their big guns at the noise. Our flash spotters will see the muzzle flashes of the German guns, pinpoint their location, and then our artillery will wipe them out." It was a game of shoot me, and the Sonic Company were the targets. August 23rd, 2000 hours. The Sonic half-tracks moved into position on the flanks of the city. The crews were nervous. They weren't just putting up fake tanks anymore. They were actively poking the hornet's nest. "Load the tapes," the lieutenant ordered. They chose Program 4, Tank Column Attack. The speakers crackled to life. Rumble, clank, roar. The sound of 50 Sherman tanks revving their engines filled the valley. The volume was cranked to maximum. The ground didn't shake, but the air vibrated. Inside the city, the German commanders reacted instantly. "Panzer attack, Sector 4!" They couldn't see anything through the hedgerows in the mist, but the sound was unmistakable. The German 88mm guns swung around. Boom, boom, boom. Shells began to scream toward the Sonic trucks. "Incoming!" The audio engineers dove into ditches. The half-tracks were parked under trees, covered in nets, blasting the noise of their own destruction. Explosions tore up the earth around them. Shrapnel pinged off the speakers. But the speakers kept playing. The fake tanks kept attacking. Back at the American Artillery Command Post, the spotters were watching. "Got 'em," a spotter said, marking a map. "Gun battery, grid square 44-98. Fire for effect." The real American artillery opened up. A massive barrage hammered the German gun positions that had just revealed themselves. The German guns fell silent. The Sonic crews dusted the dirt off their uniforms. They turned off the speakers. The valley was quiet again. They had used sound as a weapon. They had tricked the enemy into revealing his throat. But the mission took a toll. Being shelled is terrifying. Being shelled while you are defenseless, armed only with a volume knob, is a special kind of hell. The artists were learning that their fake war had very real consequences. While the tanks and speakers were the stars of the show, the 23rd realized that the devil was in the details. German intelligence was everywhere. French collaborators were watching the roads. Spies were in the bars. If a unit of soldiers drove into a town, the spies would look at their shoulder patches. They would look at the bumper markings on the jeeps. So the 23rd created a special subunit dedicated to atmosphere. This was the Special Counterintelligence Detachment. Their job was to be actors on a 24/7 stage. The sewing circle. Before every mission, the artists had to change their identity. If they were pretending to be the 6th Armored Division, every man in the 23rd had to wear the 6th Armored patch. They also had to paint the bumpers of their trucks with the 6th Armored codes.
The unit became a factory. The artists set up an assembly line. They used stencils to paint thousands of helmets and bumpers. They spent hours sewing patches onto shirts. They even forged the paperwork, leave passes, transfer orders, supply requisitions, all forged to look like they came from the 6th Armored HQ. The performance. Then they went to town. A convoy of Ghost Army trucks, carrying only 2 men each, would drive into a local French village near the front. They would park the trucks in a prominent square. The back of the trucks would be covered in canvas, but accidentally left open just enough to reveal nothing, or boxes of rations. The men would get out. They would go to the local cafe. They would order wine, and they would talk. But they wouldn't talk about art. They wouldn't talk about New York. They would talk like tankers. "God, my back hurts from that driver's seat," one would say loudly. "Yeah, the colonel says we're moving out toward Metz tomorrow," another would whisper, checking to make sure the French waiter was listening. "I hope the fuel trucks get here. The tanks are running dry." They were planting seeds of disinformation. The French waiter might mention it to his cousin. The cousin might mention it to the baker. The baker might be a German informant. Within hours, a report would land on a desk in Berlin. Elements of the 6th Armored spotted in Village X, preparing to move toward Metz. It was method acting with a death penalty. If they were captured wearing the wrong patches, they could be executed as spies. The Geneva Convention protects soldiers in uniform, but the lines were blurry when you were impersonating another unit. They even had a general. A colonel in the 23rd would often dress up as a brigadier general. He would drive around in a jeep with a general's stars on the bumper, flanked by MP escorts, also actors. He would stop at crossroads, look at maps, point imperiously at the horizon, and yell at his subordinates. German binoculars would see this. A general is scouting the area. A big attack is coming. The general was probably a set designer. The MPs were illustrators, but the performance was Oscar-worthy.
September 1944, the Moselle River. The summer was ending. The rains were coming. General Patton's Third Army was racing toward the German border, but he was running out of gas. Literally. The supply lines couldn't keep up. Patton had to halt his advance to refuel. This created a crisis. Patton stretched his army thin to cover the ground. Between the cities of Luxembourg and Thionville, a massive gap opened up in the American lines, the Bettenberg Gap. It was a 7-mile corridor of rolling hills and forests, and it was completely undefended. Facing this gap was the German Panzer Grenadier Division. They were regrouping. If they realized there was nothing in front of them, they could pour through the gap, capture the city of Luxembourg, and cut Patton's supply lines. It would be a catastrophe. The 23rd received the order, hold the gap. It was their biggest mission yet. They weren't just filling in for a unit that was resting. They were filling a void. They had to pretend to be the 6th Armored Division, a force of 15,000 men. The Ghost Army had only 1,100 men. September 15th. The convoy arrived in the rain. The mud was ankle-deep. The weather was miserable. The artists went to work. They knew the stakes. If the Germans attacked, there was no backup. The nearest American combat unit was 20 miles away. They deployed everything. Visual. They inflated every tank they had. 200 dummy Shermans. They placed them on the forward ridges, silhouetted against the sky. But they knew the Germans were smart. A tank that sits on a ridge for 3 days is suspicious. So, every night, under the cover of darkness, the flash crews, the visual deceivers, would move the tanks. They would drag the inflatable balloons 500 yards to the left. They would use bulldozers to make new tracks. In the morning, the German observers would see that the tanks had moved. They are maneuvering, the Germans would think. They are preparing for something. Sonic. The sonic crews set up a perimeter. They played the sounds of a massive buildup. They played column of tanks during the day. They played bridge building at night near the river, to make the Germans think engineers were preparing a crossing. Radio. The radio operators pulled a double shift. They created a fake headquarters net. They invented a fictional commander,
Colonel X. They scripted arguments between Colonel X and his supply officers. "Where is my fuel? I cannot attack without fuel." "It's coming, sir. The trucks are stuck in the mud." The Germans intercepted this. They concluded, "The Americans are there. They are strong, but they are waiting for fuel. We should wait too." The deception in the mud. For 7 days, the Ghost Army held the line. The rain poured down. The neoprene tanks got slippery and wet. The men were freezing in their foxholes. Every crack of thunder sounded like artillery. On the 3rd day, a German patrol probed the line. They got close, too close. A group of Ghost Army soldiers, guarding the perimeter with their real rifles, spotted the Germans. A firefight broke out. Real bullets, real blood. The artists returned fire. They weren't infantrymen, but they fought like them. They drove the German patrol back. The Germans retreated and reported, "We encountered heavy resistance. The line is fully manned." They didn't know they had just been fought off by a handful of photographers and sound engineers. September 22nd, the real 6th Armored Division finally arrived. The roar of real engines filled the valley. The commander of the 6th Armored looked at the positions the Ghost Army had held. He looked at the rubber tanks. He looked at the speakers. He shook his head. "You guys are crazy," he said. "We prefer creative," a Ghost Army captain replied. The 23rd packed up. They had held the gap. They had saved the city of Luxembourg. But there was no time to celebrate. The war was moving to the German border, the Siegfried Line, and the Germans were getting desperate.
December 1944, the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler launched his last desperate gamble. A massive surprise attack through the snowy forests of the Ardennes. Chaos engulfed the American lines. Units were overrun. Confusion was total. The Ghost Army was caught in the middle of the madness. They were in Luxembourg City when the attack started. The city was in panic. The Germans are coming back. The 23rd wasn't sent to the front lines of the Bulge. They would have been useless against the sheer weight of the German Tiger tanks. Instead, they were used to cover the retreat and reorganization. They were the masters of chaos management. They used their radio networks to confuse the Germans about where the American lines were actually forming. They set up fake gun emplacements to slow down the German advance guards. A German tank commander, seeing a line of American tanks on a ridge, would stop, deploy his unit, and call for artillery. That took time. 2 hours, 3 hours. By the time the Germans realized the tanks were fake, the real Americans had retreated to a better defensive position. The Ghost Army bought time, and in the Battle of the Bulge, time was the most valuable commodity in the world. But the 23rd was exhausted. They had been in combat for 6 months. The mental strain was unique. A regular soldier fights the enemy. The Ghost Army fought the enemy's mind. They had to be perfect 24 hours a day. If they made one mistake, the illusion would shatter. And they were about to face their final and most dangerous test, the Rhine River, the barrier to the heart of Germany. The Germans knew the Americans had to cross it. They were waiting. The 23rd would have to perform one last magic trick, and this time the audience was the entire German Army Group B.
March 1945, the Rhineland. The Allied armies had ground their way across France. They had survived the snows of the Bulge. They had cracked the Siegfried Line. Now they faced the final barrier, the moat of the fortress, the Rhine River. To the German people, the Rhine is not just a river. It is a mystical boundary. In Wagnerian opera, it is guarded by dragons and maidens. In 1945, it was guarded by the remnants of the Wehrmacht. The bridges had been blown. The water was wide, cold, and fast. On the far bank, the Germans were waiting. They had massed their artillery. They had dug their machine gun pits. They knew that if the Americans crossed the Rhine, the war was over. General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew the crossing would be a bloodbath. An amphibious assault against a fortified riverbank is a suicide mission. You are exposed in the water, you are slow, you are a target.
To succeed, the Allies needed to spread the German defenses thin. They needed the Germans to look left while the fist struck from the right. The U.S. Ninth Army, commanded by General William Simpson, was tasked with the main crossing near the town of Wesel. It was a massive operation, over 300,000 men. But Simpson had a problem. The terrain around Wesel was flat and open. The Germans could see everything. If they concentrated their reserves at Wesel, the Ninth Army would be slaughtered in the water. Simpson needed a diversion, a big one. He needed the Germans to believe that the main attack wasn't coming at Wesel, but 10 miles to the south, near the town of Viersen. He called for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The commander of the 23rd looked at the map. "General," he said, "how big of a force do you want us to simulate?" "I don't want a battalion," the general replied. "I don't want a regiment. I want you to simulate 2 full infantry divisions, the 30th and the 79th. I want you to simulate a river crossing." The Ghost Army commander swallowed hard. 2 divisions meant 30,000 men. The Ghost Army had 1,100 men left. They were being asked to inflate their numbers by 3,000%. It was Operation Viersen. It would be their masterpiece, or their tomb.
March 18, 1945. The 23rd moved into the Viersen sector. The timeline was tight. They had 3 days to build an army. The deception had to be multimedia in a way they had never attempted before. It had to be perfect visually, sonically, and electronically. The artists of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers began their work. This wasn't just about parking a few tanks in a field anymore. They had to create the infrastructure of an invasion force. They inflated hundreds of trucks. They inflated 155mm long tom artillery pieces. They didn't just place them randomly. They placed them in firing batteries, aimed at the German lines across the river. They created fake supply dumps, piles of empty boxes covered in canvas to look like ammunition crates. They created fake motor pools. But the most brilliant touch was the fake headquarters. Every division has a command post, CP. It is the brain of the army. It bustles with couriers, jeeps, and officers. The Ghost Army found a large house near the front. They set up a fake CP. They had actors dressed as majors and colonels walking in and out with maps. They had couriers on motorcycles roaring up to the front door, handing over empty envelopes and roaring away. They parked the general's jeep out front. From the German side of the river, their high-powered binoculars saw a hive of activity. "Officers are gathering," the German intelligence reported. "Supply dumps are growing. Artillery is moving into position." But the visual trickery was just the surface. The real magic was happening in the airwaves.
The Signal Company Special faced their toughest challenge. They had to simulate the radio traffic of 2 specific divisions, the 30th and the 79th. These were real units, currently resting in the rear. The Germans knew their radio signatures. They knew the call signs. They knew the fist of the operators. The Ghost Army operators had to clone them. They set up 2 distinct radio networks. Network A, the fake 30th. They generated traffic about infantry movements, river scouting, and assault boat preparations. Network B, the fake 79th. They generated traffic about heavy artillery support and bridging equipment. They played a dangerous game called spoofing. They would transmit a message in a low-level code that they knew the Germans had already broken. Condition red, assault boats to assembly area at 0400. They were practically handing the Germans the battle plan. "Here we are," the radio screamed. "We are coming at Viersen. We are coming at 0400. To sell the lie completely, they had to make sure the real 30th and 79th Divisions, hidden miles away, went completely silent. Radio silence was strictly enforced in the real army. All the noise, all the chatter, all the panic was coming from the Ghost Army's tents. Then the 23rd added a new prop to their repertoire: air power. An invasion force needs spotter planes, the L-4 Piper Cub. These small single-engine planes were the eyes of the artillery. If the Germans saw tanks and trucks but no planes, they might get suspicious. But the Ghost Army didn't have pilots, and they didn't have planes. So the engineers built them. They built fake L-4 Piper Cubs out of wood, wire, and canvas. They were crude models, but from 2,000 feet up, or from across a river, they looked real. They found a flat field near the town of Anrath. They mowed a strip of grass to look like a runway. They placed the fake planes on the strip. But a plane sitting on the ground is static, dead. The artists knew that life is in the movement. So they tied invisible fishing lines to the propellers of the fake planes. Soldiers would hide in the bushes and pull the strings, making the propellers spin in the wind. From a distance, it looked like the engines were idling, warming up for takeoff. They even drove a jeep down the runway at high speed, dragging a branch to kick up dust, simulating a plane landing. German reconnaissance aircraft flew over. They took photos. The analysts in Berlin looked at the photos. Field airstrip, operational. 6 L-4 spotters observed. Engines running. The deception was gaining mass. It was becoming real.
Night, March 23, 1945. The visual deception works during the day, but the crossing would happen at night, and at night, the ears rule the battlefield. This was the Sonic Company's finest hour. They moved their half-tracks down to the very edge of the Rhine. They were within rifle range of the German sentries on the other side. They were protected only by the dark and the fog. They set up the massive speakers. They aimed them across the black water. The playlist was River Crossing Operation. It was a complex mix. It started with the sound of trucks unloading heavy pontoon boats, the thud of wood on mud. Then the sound of air compressors inflating the rubber pontoons. Then the sound of outboard motors starting up, the splashing of water, the shouting of engineers, "Heave, heave!" The hammering of steel spans for a Bailey bridge. Sound travels strangely over water. It carries. To the terrified German soldiers in their foxholes on the East Bank, it sounded like the apocalypse. They heard an entire army assembling a bridge right in front of them. They heard the tanks revving their engines, waiting to cross. The German commanders panicked. "They are building a bridge at Viersen," the reports screamed. "They are crossing now." The German artillery opened fire. But they weren't firing blindly anymore. They were firing at the sound. Shells screamed over the river. They exploded in the mud around the Sonic trucks. The water churned with shrapnel. The men of the 23rd huddled in their foxholes. Every shell that landed near them was a victory. Every explosion that tore up a rubber tank was a triumph. Every German gun that fired at Viersen was a gun that was not pointing at Weasel. The shelling was intense. The ground shook. "Keep the tape rolling," the sergeant yelled over the roar of explosions. If they turned off the sound now, the Germans would know it was fake. A real army doesn't stop building a bridge just because of a few shells. So they kept the volume at 11. They blasted the sound of their own invasion directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. Dawn, March 24, 1945. The sun rose over the Rhine. The smoke from the German barrage hung low over the fields of Viersen. The Ghost Army was battered. Their inflatable tanks were shredded. Their fake planes were knocked over. But they were still there. And across the river, the German army was there too. The German High Command had moved the bulk of their reserves south. They had moved their panzer units to block the Viersen crossing. They were staring at the Ghost Army, waiting for the attack. 10 miles to the north, at Wesel, the silence was broken. Not by a recording, by the roar of 2,000 real guns. The Ninth Army launched the real crossing. Winston Churchill was there to watch it. General Eisenhower was there. The assault boats hit the water. But instead of a wall of fire, they met scattered resistance. The German bunkers were undermanned. The heavy artillery was pointing the wrong way, south,
toward the ghosts. The Americans stormed the east bank. They established a bridgehead. The engineers began building real bridges. Within hours, tanks were pouring across the Rhine. The gateway to Germany was kicked open. At Viersen, the Ghost Army monitored the radio. Wesel crossing successful. Casualties light. The men of the 23rd looked at each other. They were covered in mud. Their ears were ringing from the shelling. They were exhausted, but they grinned. They had just fooled the entire German army. The mission wasn't over. Now came the hardest trick: vanishing. If the Germans realized they had been duped, they would be furious. They might counterattack the Viersen sector just to wipe out the deceivers. The 23rd had to dismantle the illusion while still maintaining it. They slowly deflated the tanks one by one, replacing them with nothing. They turned down the volume on the speakers, fading the "Army" out like a song ending on the radio. They sent radio messages indicating the unit was moving out. By the time the Germans realized that the Viersen crossing was a hoax, the 23rd was gone. They packed their bags, they loaded their shredded rubber tanks onto trucks. They drove away from the river, leaving behind an empty field and a very confused enemy. General Simpson later sent a message to the 23rd. He estimated that their deception had saved at least 10,000 American lives during the Rhine crossing. 10,000 men who didn't die in the water because the German bullets were flying at speakers instead of flesh. It is easy to romanticize the Ghost Army. It sounds like a fun adventure, artists fooling Nazis, but it was still war. The men of the 23rd were not immune to the horror. During the Battle of the Bulge and during the Rhine campaign, they saw things that would haunt them forever. Art Kane, the photographer, saw bodies stacked like cordwood. Bill Blass saw the devastation of French villages. They weren't just observers, they were participants. There were casualties in the 23rd. 3 men were killed and 15 wounded during their tour of duty. It was a miracle the number wasn't higher. They were professional targets. Their job description was, "Get shot at." One night, near the end of the war, a young artist in the unit was sketching in a church that had been bombed out. He was drawing the ruins. A local French woman approached him. She looked at his uniform. She didn't see a gun. She saw a sketchbook. "Why are you here?" she asked. "To make sure they don't come back," he said. He didn't tell her that his tank was made of air. He didn't tell her that he was an illusionist. In that moment, he was just a soldier, tired and far from home, trying to find beauty in the rubble. The war was ending. The Reich was collapsing. The Ghost Army had one final journey to make, into Germany itself. But as the fighting stopped, a new problem emerged: the secret.
May 1945, Germany. The guns fell silent. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted for 12 years. Now, it was a landscape of crushed brick and twisted rebar. The Ghost Army moved deeper into Germany, but the mission had changed. They were no longer deceivers, they were occupiers. They drove their trucks past the columns of surrendered German soldiers. The Wehrmacht troops, once the terror of Europe, sat by the roadside, head in hands, defeated. The artists looked at the faces of the men they had been fighting. They weren't monsters. They were tired, dirty men. And the German soldiers looked back at the Americans. They saw the jeeps, the trucks, the uniforms. They had no idea that the unit passing them was the same unit that had tricked them at the Rhine, at Brest, and at the Moselle. They passed the real tanks of the American army, the Shermans, the Pershings. The men of the 23rd looked at the solid steel armor with a mix of envy and pride. "They have the armor," one artist said to his friend, "but we have the imagination." They saw the concentration camps. This was the moment the game ended forever. Throughout the war, the deception had felt, at times, like a college prank on a massive scale, fooling the Germans, making funny noises, dressing up. But when they saw the camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, the reality of the evil they had been fighting crashed down on them. There was no art that could camouflage this. There was no sound effect that could drown out the silence of the dead. They realized then that their deception wasn't just a trick. It was a moral imperative. Every minute they had bought, every German division they had diverted, had helped end this nightmare 1 minute sooner. VE Day. The celebration was wild, but for the 23rd, it was bittersweet. They couldn't brag. They couldn't tell the other soldiers in the bars, "We held the Bettenberg Gap." The other soldiers would ask, "With what regiment?" And the answer, "With a balloon," would have started a fight. So they drank in silence. July 1945. The Pentagon's orders. The war was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. The United States military realized they had a unique asset. They had perfected the art of strategic deception. If there was going to be a war with the Soviet Union, they might need the Ghost Army again. They couldn't let the Russians know that the Americans were masters of the fake army. So the order came down from the highest levels. Classification top secret. The men of the 23rd were gathered together one last time. An officer stood before them. His face was stern. "Gentlemen," he said, "what you did here never happened. You are not to speak of this to your wives. You are not to speak of this to your children. You are not to write about it in your diaries. There were no inflatable tanks. There were no sonic speakers. If anyone asks what you did in the war, you tell them you were in the Signal Corps. You tell them you drove a truck. You tell them you peeled potatoes. Do you understand?" They nodded. They signed the papers. The penalty for breaking the oath was court-martial, prison, disgrace. They were stripped of their unit patches. The ghost insignia was removed. They were discharged and sent home on troop ships, blended in with the infantry and the artillery. They carried their duffel bags and their sketchbooks. But the most important thing they carried was the secret.
1950s, 1980s, the art world. The men of the 23rd returned to the lives they had left behind. They went back to the studios in New York. They went back to the design firms in Philadelphia. And an amazing thing happened. The Hollywood soldiers didn't just fade away. They shaped the culture of the 20th century. Bill Blass returned to fashion. He became the king of 7th Avenue. His designs were known for their impeccable tailoring and classic American style. He dressed first ladies and movie stars. He was famous for his charm, his wit, and his eye for detail. But for 40 years, nobody knew that the man designing evening gowns had once designed fake tank battalions in the mud of France. Perhaps his understanding of structure, of how to make fabric look like something it wasn't, came from the war. Ellsworth Kelly went to Paris on the GI Bill. He became a giant of modern art. His hard-edge painting style, bold blocks of single colors, revolutionized the art world. Critics analyzed his work for decades. They talked about his use of figure-ground relationships. They didn't know that he had learned about figure and ground by trying to hide a 93-pound tank from a Luftwaffe pilot. He had learned that if you break up the shape, the object disappears. He took the logic of camouflage and turned it into high art. Arthur Singer became one of the most beloved wildlife artists in America. His book, Birds of North America, sat on millions of coffee tables. He painted feathers with the same meticulous care he had once used to paint fake unit insignias on Jeep bumpers. Art Kane became a legendary photographer. He took the famous Great Day in Harlem photograph of 57 jazz musicians. He was a master at staging, of directing people, of creating a moment. Skills honed in the villages of France, directing actors to play the role of a general. They met occasionally for reunions. They would rent a banquet hall. They would lock the doors, and only then, safe among themselves,
would they talk. They would laugh about the time the wind blew a tank into a tree. They would cry about the friends they lost. But as soon as the doors opened, the masks went back on. To the world, they were just painters and designers. The war was a blank page in their biography.
1996. 50 years had passed. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The Soviet Union was gone. The need for secrecy had evaporated. But the Pentagon moves slowly. The files gathered dust in a warehouse. Finally, thanks to the pressure of a few determined researchers and family members, the seal was broken. The documents were declassified. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The story broke. The world was stunned. It sounded like fiction. It sounded like a movie script. Inflatable tanks? Sound trucks? Artists fighting Nazis? A documentary was made. Books were written. The surviving members of the Ghost Army, now men in their 70s and 80s, were suddenly celebrities. Journalists flocked to interview them. "Why didn't you tell us?" their children asked. "We promised," they said simply. The interviews were revelatory. Bill Blass, in one of his final interviews before his death, smiled when asked about the deception. "It was the only time in my life," he said, "where being an artist was considered a matter of national security." They began to show their sketches, hundreds of drawings made during the war, watercolors of French farmhouses, charcoal sketches of tired soldiers. It was a treasure trove of war art that had been hidden in attics for half a century. It showed the war not through the eyes of a killer, but through the eyes of a creator.
March 2022, Washington, D.C. Time is the one enemy that cannot be fooled. It cannot be distracted by a sonic speaker. By 2022, most of the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army were gone. Only a handful remained. They were in their late 90s, some over 100 years old. But the country they saved finally decided to say thank you properly. President Joe Biden signed the bill, the Congressional Gold Medal. It is the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. It was awarded to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The ceremony was held at the Capitol. 3 veterans of the Ghost Army were well enough to attend. Bernie Bluestein, 98, John Christman, 97, Seymour Nussenbaum, 98. They sat in wheelchairs, their frail bodies covered in blankets. But on their lapels, they wore the new pin, the Ghost. The Speaker of the House read the citation for their unique and highly distinguished service, utilizing their creativity and ingenuity to save thousands of American lives. Bernie Bluestein looked at the medal. He thought of the mud in Normandy. He thought of the sound of the 88 shells screaming over the Rhine. He thought of the rubber tank that he had patched with a bicycle repair kit in the middle of a thunderstorm. He leaned into the microphone. "We were just doing what we had to do," he said. "We used our art to save our guys, and I do it again." It was a validation of a different kind of bravery. Not the bravery of charging a machine gun nest, but the bravery of standing in an open field armed with nothing but a balloon and saying, "Shoot at me, spare him, shoot at me."
History is often written by the victors, but it is usually written about the generals and the battleships. We remember the Bismarck. We remember the Enola Gay. We remember the Patton tanks. But the story of the Ghost Army challenges our understanding of war. It reminds us that deception is as old as the Trojan horse, but the 23rd took it to a modern, industrial level. They proved that in the chaotic mathematics of the battlefield, 1 + 1 does not always equal 2. Sometimes, if you are smart enough, 0 + 0 equals 30,000. The Germans laughed at the Hollywood soldiers. They called them amateurs. They dismissed the Americans as cowboys who didn't understand the serious business of war. But in the end, the rigid, disciplined German mind was defeated by American improvisation. The German fire control computers could calculate the trajectory of a shell, but they couldn't calculate the trajectory of an artist's imagination. They couldn't predict that the tank they saw was full of air. They couldn't predict that the radio traffic they heard was a play written by a kid from Brooklyn. The 23rd Special Troops never fired a heavy gun. They never smashed a bunker. But they achieved something arguably more difficult. They bent reality. They were the unsinkable monsters of the land war. Just like the swordfish pilots who flew their canvas string bags against the mighty Bismarck, the men of the Ghost Army flew their rubber tanks against the mighty Wehrmacht. And just like the swordfish, they won. Today, if you go to the museums, you will see the Tiger tanks and the Mustangs, but if you look closely in the corner, you might see a patch, a small triangular patch showing a ghost. It represents the army that never was, the army that shouted at the thunder, the army that proved once and for all that the pen and the paintbrush is indeed mightier than the sword.